Terminal services. Remote desktop and terminal services both share one thing in common. They both enable you to log onto a remote computer and both support the low overhead RDP 5.2 protocol. However, terminal services differs in that with the proper licensing in place, you can have more than two users log onto a server at the same time and you can take advantage of application sharing. Unlike remote desktop and remote assistance, terminal services is not actually installed by default, it must be added. But like remote desktop, terminal services listens on TCP port 3389. So make sure that you allow TCP port 3389 through a firewall if you need to connect through one, otherwise you're going to be flat out of luck before you start. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is add terminal services to our server. So we'll click on Start, Control Panel, Add or Remove Programs, and then we'll come and choose Add Remove Windows Components. Okay, so we'll scroll down and we'll find Terminal Server, so we'll place a check in that box. Now we just get a message that tells us that the default Internet Explorer Enhanced Security configuration will restrict the ability of users logged on to Terminal Server to browse the Internet. So we'll just click Yes to continue, and then we'll also select the Terminal Server licensing option. And now we'll click Next. Now here you'll get a warning message which basically says that terminal services will be installed, giving us the ability to share applications. But it also says that if you want to use terminal services for remote administration, then use remote desktop as it's already installed. Now we'll also get a warning that any applications installed on this server might no longer work and might have to be reinstalled using Add Remove Programs in the control panel. And finally, it tells us that we need to set up a licensing server within 120 days if we wish to continue using our terminal server. So if all that's okay, click Next to continue, and then we'll get the option to select a security configuration for our terminal server. Now we should choose the default, which is full security, if we have recent applications that are supported on a Windows 2003 terminal server, as obviously it provides the best security. We'd use relaxed security if we run older applications on our terminal server or users need to access the registry or certain file locations. So for our purposes, we're going to leave the default at full security. However, we can actually change between these two modes later on if we wish. So we'll click on Next, and now we have to specify the location of our licensing database and whether the licensing server will provide licenses to our entire enterprise or just a particular domain or workgroup. Now as we only have one domain here in our environment, this is kind of trivial for us, but if you do have multiple domains in your enterprise, you might want to select this option. Now we can see that our server database is going to be stored at this location, and that's fine by me. I'll accept the default and then I'll choose Next. Now make sure you do have your Windows 2003 CD-ROM in your drive because files will need to be copied to your server. Now I'll just pause this video and then we'll return once the files have copied. Okay, the files have been copied, so we'll click Finish and we'll now need to reboot our server. So I'm going to click Yes and I'll pause the video again and we'll return once our server's been rebooted. Okay, our server's been rebooted, and when we restart our server, it'll automatically pop up with the Terminal Services help file in case you need assistance. So I'll close that down, and the next thing we're going to do is we're going to go and take a look at licensing our terminal server. Now licensing our terminal server is actually a two-step process, but we've already completed step 1, which is installing the licensing service, and we did that when we checked the terminal server licensing option in Add Remove Programs. Now the second step is to activate a licensed server. Technically we don't need to do this for at least 120 days, but at some stage you'll need to activate your licensing server if you plan to continue to use terminal services. So we'll click on Start, Administrative Tools, and then we'll select Terminal Server Licensing. Now in the left hand side of our MMC we can see our All Servers icon. So if we expand this, we can see all of our licensing servers, which we can also see over here in the right hand side. So in our case we only have the one licensing server, which is Server 01. So if we right click on Server 01 and select Properties, in the drop down box we can select the method which we would like to use to activate our licensing server. Now the default is automatic, and this will require a working internet connection. Now our other options are via a web browser, which obviously also requires a working internet connection, and by telephone, where you would then select your country and then you'd manually call Microsoft to receive your licensing server activation code. Now on the Required Information tab, you'll need to enter in some company details. Now these are pretty self-explanatory. Enter in your name, your last name, your company and your country. Now this information, as the tab name suggests, is required and you won't be able to activate your licensing server without it. Now the last tab, the optional information, is as it sounds, optional. It's just some contact information, and again it's pretty self-explanatory here, so we'll move on. Now once you've filled in the appropriate information, you need to activate your licensing server with Microsoft Clearinghouse. So to do this, we'll right click on our server and we'll select Activate Server. And this starts up the Terminal Server License Server Activation Wizard. So we'll click Next. And the first thing we need to do is select an activation method, and the default is automatic. And of course we've looked at these, where other options are web browser and telephone. So we'll leave it set at automatic and we'll choose Next. Now our wizard will go off and attempt to locate a Microsoft activation server. Okay, now if you haven't done so already, you'll have to identify yourself by filling in your name and your company information. And this is the same information that you would have completed in the Required Information tab. But if you didn't do it then, you can do it now. So once you've filled this in, click on Next. Now I'm not about to go and activate this test server, so I'll explain what happens next and you'll just have to take my word for it. Now the next screen is going to ask you for the information that you completed in the Optional Information tab. So then you click Next if you want to fill that in, and then it will connect to Microsoft Clearinghouse and it will just activate your licensing server. Then you'll receive a confirmation screen at this point which has a checkbox to start another wizard to activate any client licenses, and this checkbox is selected by default. Then finally you'll be prompted to enter in your license type from a drop-down box. So once you've identified the correct type and hit Next, you're finished, you're licensed, you're legal, and you're ready to go. Okay, so that's licensing your terminal server. Now licensing applications is much easier than licensing the terminal server itself. It's the application that provides the licenses. So consider a popular application suite like Microsoft Office. The licensing method for Microsoft Office is per seat. That means that if you install Office on your terminal server and have a client license, then you're allowed to use Office. Even if Office is already installed on your local computer, you're still allowed to run Office on your terminal server as long as only one copy is running at any time. Now it should really go without saying, but make sure you thoroughly review the licensing requirements for the software that you intend to run on your terminal server to ensure you're complying with the legal requirements of the vendor. So congratulations, your terminal server is now legal. Okay, now we'll move on and we'll discuss installing applications on our terminal server. Now the first thing we should do when preparing to run applications on a terminal server is make sure that they're properly supported to run in a terminal services environment. Some things to be aware of. Firstly, 32-bit applications work best in a terminal server environment, and this is because your terminal server has to create a virtual DOS machine, or VDM, for every 16-bit application running on your terminal server. The VDM is actually a 32-bit application that runs a 16-bit application on top of it. Now whilst this still can work, it does take additional overhead. Next, programs should use usernames and not computer names to identify users. This is because we'll have multiple users running the same application on our server, and we only have one computer name. Terminal service compatible software should be able to separate the user from the computer. Next, terminal services applications should be able to store user data in user locations. So if we consider a program like Microsoft Word, if that's running on our terminal server, it'd be great to be able to store user documents in their own My Documents folder, rather than a default location on the server for everyone else to access. And finally, the application should be able to store server data in global locations. Now again, if we use Microsoft Office, we don't want to have a separate copy of clip art for everyone, wasting much needed space on the server. Items like this should be shared in a global location. Okay, be sure to consider these things before installing anything on your terminal server. Once you've done your investigative work, you're ready to begin installing your applications. Now there are two modes on a terminal server, execute mode and install mode. In execute mode, users run applications and you can install single user applications. In install mode, you can install applications that are intended for multiple users. Now when you install an application in execute mode, it installs exactly as an application would on a normal PC, creating the same registry entries it would on your local computer. In contrast, when you install an application in install mode, the application writes shadow registry entries under the terminal server registry key. Of course, you don't need to even know that this is happening, but behind the scenes, the terminal server is being configured to run multi-user applications. Okay, we'll assume that you know how to install a regular brand X application, but how do we install a multi-user application? Well, first we need to change into install mode. So how do we do this? Well, it's really simple. So on our terminal server, we'll click Start, Control Panel, Add or Remove Programs. Okay, now you're in install mode. See, I told you it was easy. Now we'll click on Add New Programs, and then we'll click on the CD or floppy button. Now the install program wizard will appear, so we'll click Next, and the wizard will begin looking for the location of any setup files. So to locate the file ourselves manually, we'll choose Browse, and then we can locate our setup file and click on Open. Now we'll click Next, and then our application will begin to install. Now you'll notice that our wizard behind here does stay open while our application is installing. So once the installation of our application is complete, we'll click the Next button and then we'll click Finish. And then our terminal server will automatically return to execute mode and then our application is installed. Now there are some applications that will have a separate install program to run to configure your application to run in a multi-user terminal server environment. So take Microsoft Office as an example. If we're using an older version of Microsoft Office like version 2000, on the Microsoft Office resource kit there's a file called termserver.mst which you must run along with setup. So to do this for Microsoft Office 2000, we'll go back and click on CD or floppy, we'll click Next. Now we'll need to find the path to our file. So what we'll do is we'll click Browse again and we'll select the path to our file. And then we'll need to come up here and append to the back of our setup file the path to the termserver.mst file, which we have to run along with setup. So that would be something like this, and we'll scroll all the way back here and we'll see that we'll be putting in there a transforms equals C:\program files and then the path through the Office resource kit all the way here to our termserver.mst file. Now if you happen to be running a newer version of Office like Office 2003, you won't need to do this because the application is terminal server aware. Now even though Office 2003 is terminal server aware, there will be some features that will not be installed automatically. So when you do run the setup, you'll notice a few items that are set to disabled and won't be installed. And these are things that require heavy animation, graphical capabilities, and things which generally will bog your terminal server down. So you'll either have to manually change those things or don't run them, which is the recommended option. But for older applications, you may have to run a transform file to get some of these applications to work. So before you go off installing your applications on your terminal server, be sure to see if such an install So before you go off installing your applications on your terminal server, be sure to check if such an installation routine exists for your application. Okay, alright, we'll close this down now. Now more than likely at some stage, you'll find yourself needing to make configuration changes to applications, especially global configuration changes that affect all users. And you might find yourself needing to put your terminal server back into install mode. Now we can also do this from the command line. So to change into install mode, we'd simply open up a command prompt and then type in change user with the /install switch. Okay, and now we get a confirmation message that says our user session is ready to install applications. Now if we do need to change back into execute mode, we can simply type in execute and hit enter, and now we're ready to execute applications again. Now alternatively, if you don't know which mode you're currently in, and more than likely that will be execute mode, but if you don't know, you can simply type in query and it will tell you which mode you're currently in. Now one final thing you'll probably need to look at during some stage of your terminal services configuration is the Windows 2003 registry. So firstly, let's fire up our registry editor and we'll click on Start, Run, and we'll type in Reg. Now one final thing you'll probably need to look at during the stage some stage of your terminal services configuration is the Windows 2003 registry. So firstly, let's fire up our registry editor by clicking on Start, Run, and then we'll type in regedit and hit Enter. Now we need to Now we'll expand our HKey local machine, software, Microsoft, and we'll scroll down and we'll locate Windows NT, current version, terminal server, compatibility, and then our applications. Now when we expand applications, one of the first things we should do is check to see if our application is already listed. If it is, there should be an associated registry key present. Now under each application registry entry, there will be 4 keys that you really need to concern yourself with. The first is first count message QPeaks sleep bad app. Now it's this key that specifies the number of times your application will query a message queue before the server considers the application is not running properly. Now the lower the value, the quicker the application will decide that the application isn't performing, and then we'll consider it running, and we'll consider it a bad application. Next we have the bad app sleep time, and this defines the number of milliseconds that a bad application will be denied CPU cycles. Next we have the bad app sleep time, and this value Next we have the bad app sleep time, and the default value is 0, and this defines the number of milliseconds that a suspended application or a bad application is going to be denied access to the CPU. Now the higher the value, the longer our application will remain suspended. Next we have the nth count message QPeaks, and this specifies the number of times our application will query the message queue before remaining. Next we have the n-count message QPeaks, and this Next we have the nth count message QPeaks. And this value defines the number of times that a suspended application will query the message queue before going back to a suspended state. Now the lower the number, the more frequently our suspended application will go back to sleep. And finally we have the flags value. And finally we have the flags key. Now the default value is 0x8, and Now finally we have the flags key, and the default value is 0x8, and that will define a 32-bit application. But of course we can change it to 0x4 if we have any 16-bit applications, or we can leave it at 0xC, which defines both. Okay, so now you know how to install applications on your terminal server and how to configure applications and their associated registry values. Now make sure you plan ahead before installing applications so you minimize your exposure to potential problems and then maximize the reliability and the performance of your terminal server. Okay, well let's move on and we'll take a look at the Terminal Services Manager. Now the Terminal Services Manager is used to see who's using our terminal server, the status of their connections, and what processes they're currently using. So to launch our Terminal Services Manager MMC, we'll click on Start, Administrative Tools, and then we'll select Terminal Services Manager. Now, because this is the first time we've run this tool, we do get a message telling us certain features like remote control will only work when we run this tool from a Terminal Service Client Connect. Now, because this is the first time that we've run our Terminal Services Manager MMC, we just get a message that tells us that certain features such as our remote control option will only work when we run this tool from a Terminal Services Client connection. So I'll click OK to dismiss that message. Okay. Alright, now in the left-hand pane of our MMC, you'll see all of the domains and terminal servers that Alright, now in the left-hand pane of our Terminal Services Manager, you'll see all the domains and all the terminal servers that are in your domain. Now you don't need to log onto every terminal server directly to manage it. You can manage all of your terminal servers from this one interface. So if we expand this computer, and then our current server, server 01, we can currently see we have two options for our local terminal server. We have the RDP TCP listener, which is the terminal server itself listening for incoming connections. And we have a console icon, which represents a logged on locally user, and that's myself. And then underneath this would have any other users that are connected to our terminal server. Now under all listed servers, we'll see the domain that we're currently connected to. Now if we double click on the domain icon, it will refresh the list of terminal servers that you can connect to. So if we expand our server, we see exactly the same options as we do up here for this computer. However, underneath this icon, we'll be able to see any additional terminal servers that we have, not just the local one. Okay, if we go and right click on our terminal server, you can choose to connect to it if you're not currently connected. You can disconnect from it if you are currently connected, and disconnecting it from a server in this sense. And disconnecting from a server in this sense doesn't disconnect users from their Terminal Services session, it just disconnects the Terminal Services Manager from the terminal server. Now we can also add this server to our list of favorites, and this will add the server to the favorite servers icon that you see over here. And of course, if the terminal server already is added to our favorites, we could remove it from our favorites as well. Okay, now if we right click on a user's session, we have the option of connecting to their session if the status is currently disconnected. We can disconnect their session if they are currently connected. We could send them a pop-up message, initiate a remote control session to the user's desktop, reset their session, which is useful if a user's session isn't responding. However, this option will lose any unsaved work they might have. And finally, we can check the network statistics for the user's session by selecting the status option. Now all of these options are also available on the Actions menu. Now if we click on Tools and then Options, we can set the refresh intervals for updating the Processes tabs and the dialog boxes. And we can also set whether we want to see confirmation messages and so on. Now we'll go back and click on our server, and in the right hand pane you can see we have three tabs: Users, Sessions and Processes. Now the default tab, which is the User tab, we can see the name of the server. Now on the default tab, which is our Users tab, we can see the user that's currently connected, how they're currently connected, we can see the ID of their connection, and this is useful especially if we want to manage this session using the command line tools. Next we see the state of the connection, and it will be either active, connected, connect query, which means it's in the process of connecting, remote control, listening, or disconnected. Disconnected, idle, initializing, or down, which means that the session has failed to initialize properly. We can also see the amount of idle time that has been. We can also see the amount of idle time that has. We can also see how long the user's session has been idle, and of course when they last logged on. Now over here you'll notice that my administrator account has a green icon. Now the icon here will be white for any regular users and green for any administrators. So there's a little white. So that just gives you a visual cue if you have any administrators on there. Now if we want to refresh this screen, we can come up here and hit the refresh now icon. But we'll move on and we'll take a look at what's on the sessions tab. Now here we can see who has open sessions currently to our server. Now the top session, and here we can see our console session for our administrator account. And we can see all the information that we saw over here on the users tab. Now the second option we can see here, this RDP TCP, is the ID of is the terminal server itself. Now we don't actually have any user because it's running as the system account with the ID of 65536. We can see the state is listening, and this is because the terminal server itself is just sitting there listening for any incoming. And this is because the terminal server itself is just sitting there quietly listening for any incoming RDP connections. Okay, and over here the rest of these fields are blank because there's no user activity. Okay, the next tab is the Processes tab. And here we can see any processes that are currently running on our terminal server. It shows the context of which user is running the account. On the left hand side it will show which user is currently running that process. The session shows us whether the process has been initiated from a terminal services session or whether it's been initiated from a local console session. Next we can see the ID of the user and of course the process ID. And then we can see over here the actual name of the process. Now let's say that we've launched an application and for some reason it's hung and it's chewing up CPU cycles. From this window here we can terminate the rogue process simply by selecting a process, right clicking and then choosing end process. Now you'll get a confirmation which does ask you to click OK to kill the process. I'll just choose no, but alternatively once you have this process ID you can use a remote tool like rkill or pskill from Win2003 to remotely terminate a rogue process. Now this view of course does show all users. But if you only want to see processes for a single user, we can come over here to the left hand side, select our user account, and then we'll see all the processes which are running under our administrator. Now in this same view we also have an information tab which will just give us some more information about our user. Although this option only works for a user that is connected via terminal servers. Although this option only works for a user that is connected to a terminal services connection and not via the system console. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Start, All Programs, Accessories, Communications, and I'm going to launch the remote desktop connection. And I'm just going to click Connect. And I'm just going to log my administrator in. Okay, and now my administrator is logged in via Terminal Services. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to minimize this application here. And over here now we can see that we do have another RDP TCP connection, number 4, via the administrator. So if we select that, over here on the right hand side we can now see some statistics. So here we can see that our username that's connected is the administrator. They're connecting from a client called Server 01, which happens to be this server. We can see the client build number, which just corresponds to Windows Server 2003. And we can see some other miscellaneous information such as the client's IP address, what sort of color depth they're connecting using, and of course what resolution. Okay, so that's the Terminal Services Manager in detail. Now we've seen how to monitor user sessions, connect and disconnect to servers and users' connections, and there's a lot of information within the confines of this tool. So I thoroughly recommend you have a good look at the options available within this extremely useful Terminal Services MMC. Now whilst the Terminal Services Manager MMC can monitor and control connections to all terminal servers in your network, the Terminal Services Configuration MMC gives you more granular control over the local terminal server on which it's installed. So I'm going to close this down, and I'll also just disconnect from this session. And now I'll go and click on Start, Administrative Tools, and then we'll come down here and launch our Terminal Services Configuration MMC. Okay, now on the left hand side of our MMC we've got two options. We've got Connections and Server Settings. So we'll click on Server Settings, and in the right hand side you can see we have 7 other options. Now these are fairly self-explanatory. Our first 2 options relate to the use of temporary files on our terminal server. So firstly, do we want to delete temporary folders on exit? The default is yes. I recommend you leave it as yes. And secondly, do we want to use temp folders? And secondly, do we want to use temporary folders at all? Well, the default again is yes. And now secondly, do we want to use temporary folders at all? Well, and secondly, do we want to use temporary folders at all? Well, the default again is yes, and I recommend you do leave it at yes for maximum performance. Okay, next we have licensing, and licensing is set per device, but we can also set it per user. Next we have active desktop. Do we want to enable or disable active desktop? Now the default is disabled. I recommend, unless you have any burning desire to run an active desktop, that you leave it at disabled. Now next we see an option for our permission compatibility. Now when we installed our terminal server we set the option to full security, and I said that we could change it later on. Well, here's where we'll do that. So if we right click and select properties, we can change back into relaxed security mode. Now you'd only really do this if you have any problems running any older applications which need to access certain things like the registry. Okay, our next option is to restrict each user to one terminal services session, and the default is yes. And finally we have session directory, which is disabled, and this is used to manage sessions in a clustered environment. Okay, we'll go over here to the left and we'll choose connections. Now on the right hand side we can see a single RDP TCP connection type for our terminal server. Now we can also see that it's using TCP as its transport type protocol, and it's using the RDP 5.2 version of the remote desktop protocol. So if we right click and we'll select properties, and we select all tasks, we can choose to disable this connection or rename the connection. Now renaming our connection will change the session ID that you see in the Terminal Services Manager MMC, and generally most people don't seem to change these, but if you have a great number of terminal servers in your network it can make it a little easier to identify which is which, especially when you're looking at a mountain of terminal servers in the Terminal Service Manager MMC. Okay, well we'll right click again, and this time we'll select properties, and this is where we can set the server settings that override the settings at the user account properties, which we will discuss a little later on. Now firstly we have the General tab, and this is where we can add a comment about this server and set up our encryption and authentication methods. Now up the top here we do also see our connection name. Now if we did happen to rename that connection earlier, we'd see that reflected here. So if we go back, we'll right click, select all tasks and rename our connection, and we'll just call this server TRM and we'll click on OK. And we'll just simply call this one server 01 and we'll click on OK. And now we can see our connection type has changed to server 01, so if we right click and select properties, up here we can see it's also reflected as server 01. Okay, our default encryption method is set to client compatible, and this setting uses the maximum possible encryption that's supported by the client in both directions. Now using the drop down box we could change this to low, and this setting will just send data from the client to the server using a standard encryption key. Now we also have high encryption, and this setting sends encrypted data in both directions using the maximum key length which is supported. And this is great for security, but if your client doesn't support this method, then the client won't be allowed to connect. And finally, we have the Fips compliant encryption, and this method encrypts data in both directions using the Federal Information Processing Standard. Now I'll just leave the default there, and down here we can see we have an option to use standard Windows authentication. Now what this box will do is set your terminal server not to use any other alternative authentication packages that you might have installed on your server. So in our example, checking this box here will absolutely do nothing. But if we did have a different authentication method option, installed on our terminal server, then selecting this box would override that alternative authentication method. Okay, so we'll just leave that alone, and we'll move on to our next tab, which is Logon Settings. Here we can set a default username and password for our clients to log on as. Now in most cases, people will just accept the default setting here, which is for the client to provide their own logon details. But if we really wanted to lock down this terminal server with a standard logon for everyone to use, we could use this setting to completely automate their logon for them. On the Sessions tab, we can set the timeout values for our users' sessions. Now we can see that everything here is grayed out, which then uses the settings which are defined by the client. But if we choose to override the user's settings, then we can enforce these settings regardless of what the client wants. So here we can set whether we want to end a disconnected session. Now in most cases, ending a disconnected session is a good idea to save wasted resources. However, let's say that we have a terminal services user that needs to run a database report that takes several hours to complete. In this instance, we can prevent this account from being terminated when a session is disconnected. Now a disconnected session can occur when a terminal services session is not closed out properly by being logged off, or when a user simply closes their terminal services window by using the X at the top right of the window like we did a moment ago. So in a nutshell, we can use this setting to close or continue sessions that are disconnected. Now next we have the active session limit. When a session is considered active, it means that there is user activity occurring in it. When a user session is considered as active, it means that there is user activity occurring within the session. User activity could be something like mouse movements or keyboard presses, for example. Now if you want to limit your users to only be able to log on for a maximum amount of continual time, we can choose a time limit in the drop-down box. Now the default, of course, is never, and a user simply has to reconnect to resume accessing the terminal server. Now our idle session limits comes next. Now this is a great idea for people that tend to go walkabout for days on end and leave their terminal services sessions logged in. Now this is a great idea for people that tend to go walkabout for days on end and leave their terminal services sessions logged in. Now we can couple these two settings with the next two radio buttons here. So we can choose whether to disconnect or end a terminal services session when the session limit has been reached by one of these two above. Now, disconnecting a session does keep the user's desktop alive, but of course consumes resources on the terminal server. Now, this means that if a user reconnects, they will be able to resume where they left off, complete with any applications still running on the server. However, ending a session completely terminates the terminal service's session, closing any applications running under this user account. Of course, other users running the same applications will be unaffected by this, and they can keep on using their applications quite happily. Now, this user's session will then have to be re-established by them logging onto the terminal server again. And finally, down here we have the Allow Reconnection option. Now, we can choose to allow the users to reconnect from any client, or to restrict the connection to only allowing the user to reconnect from the client computer that started the original connection. Okay, next we have our Environment tab. And this allows you to choose if you want to run a program when we start our connection. Now, the program will start on the remote terminal server, not on your local computer. So we would simply check this box and then type in the name of the application that we wish to run. So for example, if we wanted to run Notepad on startup, we would simply type in notepad.exe, and in the startup we'd simply type in %systemroot. Now, an important thing to realise with this setting, as with the remote desktop feature of Windows 2003, is that if you do elect to run a program at startup, then that is all the user can do. So in this example, our user will connect to a terminal server and Notepad will be automatically launched. Now, if the user closes Notepad, then their terminal session will disconnect. So a rule of thumb here is if the user needs to run multiple applications or remain logged onto the terminal server to do other things, don't choose this option. Now, this rule also applies if this setting is chosen at the client end of the connection via the Programs tab in the Remote Desktop Connections utility, and we would have seen that in our Remote Desktop videos. Now, our Remote Control tab is where we allow the use of remote control or shadowing of a user's terminal server session. The default here is to use the client settings, which we'll see a little later on. But again, if you wish to override the client settings, you can certainly do that here. On the client setting tabs, the default is to use the connection settings from the client's connection. But we can certainly override that if we wish. Now, in a terminal server, the default is to limit the maximum color depth to 16-bit color or 65,000 colors. Now, generally that is more than enough for most terminal services users, but if you wish to change it, you certainly can. You can change it all the way down from 8-bit 256 colors all the way up to 200. You can change it all the way down from 256 colors using 8-bit color depth, all the way up to 16.7 million colors using 24-bit. And of course, our other options down here is we can disable any of these options. So if you don't want to a terminal service user be able to use a parallel port, we could simply check this box. Now, our other options down here are to disable any of our drive mappings, printer mappings, any of our parallel ports, serial ports, and so on. Now, on the Network Adapter tab, we can specify which network cards we can use for terminal services connections. Now, the default is all network cards, but you can select any individual cards that you might have from this drop-down box. Now, down here for each card, we can also set how many connections we'll allow on that network card. Now, the default is unlimited, but if you want to have a maximum amount of connections, we can simply check this box and then provide a value over here on the right. Okay, finally on our Permissions tab, we can set which users or groups are allowed to access our terminal server. Now, by default, the administrators and the system account have full control. But the default group, the Remote Desktop Users group, which is where you'll place your users to access your terminal server, will have user access and guest access. Now it's best practice not to add any other groups that require access to the terminal server in here. What we'd do is we'd add them in to the remote desktop users group. That way we only have a single location for our administration. Okay, another thing we can do is right click on connections, and we can also create a new connection. And this starts up the terminal services connection wizard. So we'll click next, and then we first get to specify what type of connection we want to apply. Now the default is a Microsoft RDP 5.2 connection, and that's the only option that I actually have available here at the moment. So we'll obviously select that, we'll choose next, and then we can select our encryption method. And of course we have client compatible, low, high and Fips compliant, and we spoke about that earlier. And of course we also have the option of using standard Windows authentication and overriding any custom authentication methods we might be currently using. So we'll select next. And here we can set our defaults for using remote control, and we've talked about that before, so again we'll choose next. And now we just need to specify a name for our connection. So I'm just going to call this one test. We can provide any optional comments and of course select a transport type which defaults to TCP. So again we'll click on next, and then we need to tell the wizard which network card we want to use. So the default is to use all of our network cards, but of course we can come and choose any one we like. So I'm just going to choose this, and we'll choose next. So I'm going to choose our second network card, and I'm going to choose next, and we will get an error because in our situation we can't use a different connection type, transport or network adapter. And finally we have to choose a network adapter. And finally we get to choose a network adapter that we're going to use for this connection, and of course the number of connections we'll use. So simply select the network adapter and then click on next. Now we will get an error here, as you've just seen, although it doesn't really look like an error, but it is. It's telling us that we need to have a unique connection type, transport type or network adapter. Now seeing as all of these three things are being used, Now seeing as all of these three items are already being used in our existing connection, we can't provide one that's unique. But I just wanted to show you this wizard just to quickly show you how to add a new connection. So what I'll do is I'll cancel out of this, but in your situation when you do successfully complete the wizard, you'll see an additional connection listed here, and then you can configure that connection just as we did this one. Okay, that's the server settings for our terminal server. Now let's go and move on, and we'll take a look at configuring the individual user properties. So I'm going to click on Start, Administrative Tools, and launch Active Directory Users and Computers. Now before any of our users can actually access our terminal server, they need to be a member of the Remote Desktop Users group. And if we go and click on our built-in OU, I'll just expand this, and we can see here that we have a Remote Desktop Users group. So if we right click on our Remote Desktop Users group and select Properties, and we'll go to our Members tab, we can see that currently we have one member, which is XP User 1. Now if your terminal server happens to be located on domain controller, then you're still going to have one more configuration step. You'll need to configure the default domain security policy to allow terminal server connections for any user other than administrators. So what we'd do is we'd click on Start, Administrative Tools, and then launch our domain controller security policy. Now we'll expand our local policies and then our user rights assignment. Now on the right here we can see an allow logon through terminal services policy, and the setting is currently not defined. So we'll right click, select Properties, and then we'll need to define these policy settings. And from here we can add in a user or group that we're going to give access to our terminal server. So we'll click on Add, we'll then click Browse, Advanced, Find Now, and then we can add in users or groups that we want to grant access to our terminal server. Now just remember though, if you do happen to select an individual user account, then this user must also be part of the remote desktop users group, or they will be denied access to this server, even though you've explicitly allowed them access in the domain controller security policy. Now also, as a final note, even though administrators by default are the only users that can access a terminal server running on a domain controller, if we add users in individually to this policy we've just defined, we'll find that the administrators are even locked out. So make sure you explicitly allow the administrators group as well in here, or add the administrators group to the remote desktop users group. Now when you're done, you can refresh the policy on the domain controller by going to a command prompt and then typing in GP update with the force switch. Okay, now with our base access permissions out of the way, let's have a look at the terminal server configuration options for an individual user account. So we'll close all this down and I'll go back to my users OU and I'll select my XP user 1. We'll right click on his account and we'll select properties. Now there's 4 tabs that have something to do with terminal services. And the first one is Terminal Services Profile. And this tab allows you to set up a profile path for the user's Terminal Services account. Now this is the same sort of setting that you'd normally set on the regular Profile tab, except this tab only applies when we're logged on via Terminal Services. The Allow Logon to Terminal Server checkbox, which is checked by default, must be enabled if you do want a user to log on to a terminal server. So uncheck this box if you wish to deny the ability for this user to log on to our terminal server. Next we have the Remote Control tab, and the default is to enable remote control. And of course, remote control will enable an administrator to remotely control or remotely observe a user's terminal service session. So for this remote control to occur, the Enable Remote Control box must be checked. Now the next checkbox here requires permission from the user before you can observe their terminal service session. Now I recommend you leave this session checked unless you have a really good reason for spying on your users. Now finally, we have these last 2 radio buttons which select whether you can just view a user's session or you can actually interact with that user's session. Now next we have the Environment tab. And here's where we can specify if we want to run a program when we start the connection. Now we have looked at this before in our Terminal Service Configuration MMC. Now don't forget that this program that you specify will run on the remote terminal server, not on your local computer. So again, just to reiterate, if we wanted to run Notepad, we'd simply type in Notepad here, and in this box we'd type in the path to the Notepad application. Now as an important subtle reminder, don't forget that with this setting, if you do elect to run an application at startup, then that's all this user will be able to do. So in this example, our XP user 1 will connect to the terminal server and then Notepad will be automatically launched. So when XP user 1 closes Notepad, then their terminal session will disconnect. Now our final tab here is the Sessions tab. And we've seen these options before. We can end a disconnected session. Now in most cases, ending a disconnected session is a good idea, and we've talked about that before. Now in most cases, ending a disconnected session is a good idea, especially if you have a limited number of licenses that your users can use. So any disconnected sessions, we can actually terminate them and then another user will be able to pick up that license and access your terminal server. Now next we have the active session limit and the idle session limit and what we're going to do when one of those limits are reached. And we talked about that a little earlier. And of course down here we can see the allow reconnection option from any client or only the client that initiated the original connection. Now generally speaking, most of the defaults we've looked at here under the user account properties will suffice for most people. But as you can also see, we've got quite a lot of options here under the properties of a user account. Now remember, any settings that you configure at the user account level will be overridden by the settings that are configured at the server level using the Terminal Services Configuration MMC. Okay, so that's the client configuration properties. Okay, so that's the user account properties for terminal services. So as long as your DNS is working properly and you have port 3389 open in your network to be able So as long as DNS is functioning correctly in your environment and your terminal server is able to receive requests on port 3389, you shouldn't have any problems. But if you do want to test connectivity to port 3389, we can simply open up a command prompt. But if you do want to test connectivity to port 3389, we could simply open up a command prompt and then we could type in telnet to the name of our server followed by the port. Okay, now if we can successfully connect, we'll just get a flashing cursor as we can see here. Now this telnet session, by the way, will consume an idle session. Now if we just leave this cursor sitting there flashing away, you will find it will disconnect after a few minutes. Now if telnetting to your terminal server doesn't work, we've got a few things that we can look at. Now if you can connect by replacing the host name of the box, in our case server 01, with the IP address of the server, then you probably have a DNS or WINS resolution problem. But if you find you can't connect with the server name, the IP address, the host name or the computer name, then you'll find that it's likely that port 3389 is blocked somewhere in your environment. Okay, there we have terminal services on Windows 2003. Terminal services is a great way of making use of legacy hardware because it doesn't require much grunt from a client perspective to be able to use a terminal server. Okay, there we have terminal services on Windows 2003. Terminal services is a great way of making use of legacy hardware because it doesn't require much grunt from a client perspective to be able to use a terminal server. It also makes administration easier because you only have one server full of applications to support rather than lots of client computers with those same applications. Terminal services under Windows 2003 is a very robust and mature application, and now thanks to the RDP 5.2 protocol, it's also a very fast one.